Welcome, Plant Soil Science Spotlight. My name is Josh Lofton, and today we're going to do something a little bit different. We've typically used this Plant Soil Science Spotlight as a means to highlight certain things going on in the field, whether that was a project, a trial that we wanted to let everybody have a look at, maybe an important agronomic thing that growers needed to be aware of. But we also wanted to highlight some of the other aspects we do here in the department. And one of those is these individual presentations for a specific project. Not only us, but our graduate students put a lot of time and effort into these individual projects, and they are often highlighted at national meetings or some sort of professional society meetings. When we get down to the grower level, these are often only interpreted in some of our extension presentations, and our growers don't typically see the justification for why we're doing this, some of the methods, the results, and the conclusions that we would typically see in a scientific meeting. So we wanted to actually highlight some of these very important projects that we have going on in the field that we use to make those interpretations or those presentations at field days and grower meetings, and let the growers actually see what's going on, the individual research that they're funding through checkoff dollars, or maybe that we're getting from national grants, and some of the stuff that we're doing on a trial by trial basis. So we wanted to first highlight a project here that was funded by the Oklahoma Soybean Board, funded by the Soybean Checkoff. And it involves the impact of planting date on early season weed management. As I said, my name is Josh Lofton, done by the cropping system team here at Oklahoma State University. When we talk about soybeans, the United States plants approximately 83,000 acres of soybeans in 2020 and produces about 41 billion bushels. Oklahoma soybean production is a lot lower, and oftentimes because of the total amount of acres that we plant and the overall production, not only total production but also production per acre, is a lot lower than some of our more prominent soybean producing states, that we aren't often considered a prominent player in the soybean industry in the United States. However, in Oklahoma, soybean itself does play a very important role, particularly in summer crop production, with it being the highest planted for total acres crop in 2020 at 560,000 acres. And we're still working out actual harvested acres, but projected harvested acres was the highest harvested summer crop in 2020 as well. So while we might not be a player on the big stage, soybean itself is a very important summer crop here in the state of Oklahoma. Now, throughout the United States, if not throughout the world, one of the most difficult management aspects in soybean production is weed control. It's also one of the costliest. Looking at production budgets, depending on your system and depending on how many applications and what chemicals you use, herbicide costs and those to control weeds can be as much as 20% of the yearly flexible budget. So those things you predict or you estimate that you're going to spend maybe one year but not the other. So excluding things like rent cost and some of those fixed costs. But the flexible, it's quite a high percent of the flexible budget. In addition, it's one of the most impactful for yield. A meta-analysis in 2017 showed that in 20 years of surveys of soybean production across the world, if weeds are left uncontrolled in soybean production systems, we could lose as much as 52% of yield at the end of the year. So almost half of our yield can be attributed to making sure that our weeds in our soybean systems are kept well in control. And when we don't control those weeds in our soybean system, we're typically left with yield loss, often associated with lower leaf area. We'll see this. We see less canopy whenever we have weeds in the system. The leaves are typically a lot smaller because they are competing with those weeds in the system. A lot lower branching potential, so we'll see more of those single stalk, not as many branches on the plant. And then our inflorescence and our pods per plant will be significantly lower. And that was a study done by in 1992. And they kind of also indicated that a lot of this wasn't necessarily due to competition of sunlight, wasn't necessarily due to a lot of competition of nutrients, but it was a lot to do with moisture competition. The weeds taking out some of that soil moisture, not allowing that access to the soybean plant, was really contributing a lot to these physiological effects of the weeds in the system. Timing's also very critical. We want to be as weed-free as we possibly can, and that's our best case scenario, but the literature has suggested that early season weed control is the most critical. One, it's the time that the soybean plant really can't fend for itself. It has very little competitive advantage to some of our weeds, especially if our weeds have a head start on those soybean plants. That they're a lot less competitive and they can't do as much. If we do get a soybean plant that is competitive, gets a lot of early season top growth, we often denote that as one that doesn't have a good stable root system as well. So really tricky and really challenging to have weeds in your system early, because it doesn't set that soybean plant up really good for the long term. A very critical aspect of an IPM approach to weed management is to make sure that we have a weed-free period. And that weed-free period is very tricky. And that's kind of what we're going to be talking about today, is how long that weed-free period. And this is a certain point in time early in the season to where we don't allow weeds into the system. If not, it's often been suggested a 3 to 6 week weed-free period, and we'll talk about how challenging that is here in a slide or two. And that's actually what we have in Oklahoma, is making sure that we have a 3 and 6 week management plan just in case we have weeds in the system. Some other states go by a growth stage, so we need to be weed free until a certain amount of leaf production or to a certain growth stage. Those often are maybe a little bit better, but those also face very large challenges associated with kind of timing in different production systems. So as we talked about, challenges arise when we bring in the cultural management practice. In Oklahoma, our planting dates are not strict in stone and a very narrow range. We actually have a very wide window. While we typically have this almost bimodal planting area to where we plant a little bit in April and May, and then we plant a little bit more in June and July, we do have growers that plant pretty much from April all the way through July consistently. We don't, in practice, we might not have that break that we recommend, but we have a very wide range, ranging from the April for the full season all the way through June and July for our double crop. So if we take that 3 to 6 week weed-free period, this is where things get really tricky. A 6 week weed-free period in a full season, early planted April, that's got a lot of vegetative growth to it, can still be during the vegetative period. And it can be fairly early. We can have a couple more weeks of vegetative growth before we go reproductive at 6 weeks. And so a good weed-free period there would be probably adequate, because that's about the time we would expect the canopy to close over and those soybeans to be able to be a lot more hardy against weed infestations, because it can compete quite readily. However, in our double crop system, that mid to late June into the July planted system, 6 weeks can be often into reproductive growth. We could have flowers or even pods on that plant when we get to a 6 week period. And so we're not comparing apples to apples here. We're almost apples to oranges based on our cultural management practice of when the 6 week period is. So we don't know if that holds true, that we need to maintain that 6 week weed-free period, and based on label consideration, we might not be able to with our more traditional herbicides that we use, or our more modern day traditional, if you will, in the Roundup Ready age, those herbicides that we have in those systems, because we lose a lot of applications once we get into that reproductive growth. So we determined that we need to evaluate the impact of cultural management on early season weed management. So this was a trial that was done actually in Perkins and Bixby. However, the data from Perkins, we didn't get good consistent data because of deer pressure there. So we have it at the Mingo Valley Research Station in Bixby, Oklahoma. A couple of really important notes. This was irrigated. It was heavily irrigated in 2017. It was a very dry year. But in 2018, we didn't pass any irrigation treatments over it just because the natural moisture just were able to sustain us, and we didn't have a need for those irrigation. About every time we got into where we just were about to pull the trigger on the irrigation, we got at least a little bit of a rainfall. And then the soil over there is a silty clay loam, so more of a heavier soil compared to some of the places out west where we grow more in loamy or sandier loam. So a lot heavier of a soil. So our treatments, we have 3 different planting dates, a timely full season. So for the eastern side of the state, this is looking into late April, early May, and this is going to be designated, the rest of the presentation as early. A late full season, so this would still be considered a full season. This kind of be right at the end of our recommended planting window, and this is going to be mid-May, denoted as delayed. And then we're going to have a double crop, which we planted approximately mid-June, and that's going to be denoted not as double crop, but as late in this presentation. And then we had a couple of herbicide schemes. We had a pre-plant herbicide, and this was a yes/no. So either we had a pre-plant program or we didn't have a pre-plant program. And then we had 2 different in-season programs, being a 3-week only application and a 3 and 6 week only application. So if you're kind of keeping track at home, that would be a total of 18 treatments we evaluated in this project. So our treatments, just so we're kind of all on the same playing field on what we used. Our pre-plant program was glyphosate, dicamba, and peroxysulfone, so that would be through Zidua. And we use typical labeled rates, and those rates are there at the bottom of the slide. Our in-season applications for both applications were just glyphosate and dicamba. These were extend beans, so we just went with that very traditional glyphosate and dicamba application. We actually did have a study looking at our traditional herbicides. The long story short, produced very similar results that we found. So we do have other herbicide options, and they work very well. We not only are relying on that glyphosate and dicamba, we can use things like Cobra and Blazer and get a pretty good and similar results out of what we found here that we're going to go over today. So the first thing that we'll look at is weed pressure. Because this is an herbicide program, the all intent is that we get good control on our weeds. And so I'm going to set up this graph for you here. The bottom half of the graph, this x-axis is our treatment, so that'd be early, delayed, and late planted. And then we either have a no in-season, a 3-week only, 3 and 6 week application, with the blue bars being where no pre was applied, and the orange bars being where pre was applied, and the gray bar being the difference between the blue and the orange bar. And then what we're actually measuring is percent weed coverage between the rows. We actually separated the rows in field, and we took Canopeo measurements and to get a quantitative, non-biased estimation of percent weeds in between the rows. So this would be what you would be concerned about and what you would be managing with a typical over-the-top application of herbicide. What we saw is that if you plant early, we really got a lot of good use out of our pre-plant herbicide program. We did get a little bit of a benefit from our in-season application, but a lot of the weed control came in, at least in this year in 2017, a lot of it came from our pre-program. We only had 10% weed coverage even when we made no in-season applications. We did shrink that down to 5% coverage when we made those in-season applications. Oh, and this was an estimation made at the R2 growth stage. When we were a little bit delayed, the value of the in-season comes in a lot stronger, but the value of pre-plant still is very evident, where we were getting approximately still 30 to 40% value between no pre and pre-applied in these systems. But we were seeing a lot bigger response and a lot bigger benefit from the in-season applications when paired with a pre-emergence program. Our late, this is that double crop, was a little bit different, especially where we had no in-season control. We didn't really get great control where we even applied a pre. where we had no in-season management. This was in particular, and we'll talk about it when we talk about yield. I think a lot of this has to do with the weather conditions that were around planting. We had good conditions to plant, but we missed a couple of rains that we had a really good chance of getting, and so we potentially didn't have really good efficacy and incorporation of that pre-program in our double crop. And we all know double crop, that is a major concern, is trying to get that herbicide through the residue into a double crop system. We see that when we make that 3-week application, that contributed an additional 20% good weed control. 3 and 6 weeks where we really didn't get good pre-emergence control because we had 60% weeds. Where we did that very long term, we dropped down to about 15% weed coverage in between the rows. And we got a lot of work, a lot of really good work from our in-season application with this late, because we just didn't get really good incorporation of our pre's in 2017. Looking at very similar things, the graph is set up very similar between 2018. Again, looking at our treatments here, percent coverage between the rows of our non-pre, pre, and the difference between the two. We see here that we got very similar trends. We got really good control from our pre-emergence program where we planted early. Our in-season actually contributed a lot more in 2018 than it did in 2017, but we also had a lot better conditions. And once again, we said at the beginning, when it's really good conditions for soybean, it's also really good conditions for weeds. And we had to keep those at bay, where in 2017, because we were a little bit drier, the conditions, the environment kind of kept those at bay. And we had to do a lot more legwork here in 2018. Very similar trend found with our delayed planting that made planting to where we got a little bit less efficacy of that pre-emergence program, but our in-season did a lot of good work to kind of keep that at a minimum. And then once again, we didn't get as considering the no pre-applied was up at 95% coverage between the rows. We were only at 55% where we had no in-season coverage. No in-season applications, I apologize, and we got a really good benefit from our in-season applications to where we see down here with the pre and in-season, we're at approximately 5% weed coverage between the rows and really good control when those are paired. So really good response. Our in-season is still very valuable. We get good control through 6 to 8 weeks, depending on when your planting date is from our pre's, if everything gets applied and incorporated really well. So going on to yields, we didn't have a different response or comparing our pre's with our different in-season. It's called an interaction. We didn't have a good interaction between our two programs. So universally across all of our other planting dates and application methods, pre-plant herbicide programs significantly increased yield. And we see here this was an increase by about 500 to 600 pounds per acre. So we're looking at approximately 10 bushels benefit from applying a pre and a little bit larger of a benefit here in 2018. But once again, significant between years. The true value maybe was not necessarily in the amount of full season control with the pre's, but maybe early season, because we, even where we didn't get a really good benefit in the weed control that we saw previously, particularly in 2017, we did see a really good value on crop yield. So looking at our other applications, once again, we don't have a pre or no pre because it was just universally well to put a pre across the board. And so these are our other applications when pre was applied. And so a couple of really interesting things to note. One, from an agronomic standpoint, we do get less and less yield potential as we go later in the season. That can be expected. The later we go, the lower the yield potential is. So we'd like to see that earlier April planting is kind of the best situation. We lose a little bit as we go into the late May, and then we don't have the yield potential in the June. However, once again, if you are taking off a wheat crop, there is some value to that if you are in a true double crop system. But from a weed control or a treatment standpoint, what we did see is a significant decrease or a significant increase in yield where we went for that 3 and 6 week after emergence application for both the early and the delayed. In both years, there was not a significant difference at the 3 weeks between either the no in-season applied or the 3 and 6 weeks. It was kind of a bridge in between. And so it's kind of tough to say the value of that 3 week application, but the 3 and 6 week long control did significantly improve yield compared to where we had no in-season herbicide applied when pre was applied. When we got to the in-season, while the weed control was really strong, we really didn't get any yield benefit from it. And I think a lot of that has to do with the yield potential of this situation. So once again, this is the yield graph to the left here, but our weather from the or on the right. This is precipitation in inches in our various months of the growing season. The blue line represents the actual precipitation. The orange represents the difference from average based on mesonet. And we have a mesonet station not but 100 yards from this trial. And what we see is in June, July, and September, we had really below average rainfall. And even in June and September, we're looking at nearly 3 to 4 inches below average rainfall conditions, to where we were only getting I think this was like just under 2 inches, and this was just under an inch and a half, and this was just under 2 inches of rain during those months. So with the lower yield potential, particularly of this double crop system that went in or during June, I don't think we just really realized the value of the weed control. Remember, we talked about earlier, the more weeds you had didn't necessarily interfere with sunlight capture or nutrient management. It was a lot to do with soil moisture competition. And I think when moisture was low, even just having a little bit of weeds early just really did a number on us. And remember, when we talked about our pre-emergence program, this is when we applied that pre-emergence for that double crop system, or that late planting, and when we see the really low rainfall conditions that may have contributed to the lower impact of that from a weed management standpoint. 2018 was a little bit different, same general trend, and from an agronomic standpoint, we did have that decreased yield potential going from early to delayed to late. But we see a lot of these differences are a little bit exasperated, or exasperated that they're larger, much larger than you would expect. And a lot of this has to do with the yield potential. We're up at now 4,000 to 4,500 pounds compared to last season. We were around that 25 to 3,000 pounds, so quite a bit higher. And generally speaking, while the trends are the same, the differences are a lot more stark between the benefits of these applications. Very similar to what we saw last year is that 3 and 6 week application was significant for the early and the delayed compared to where no in-season was applied. However, we also saw a significant value of that late season application. We did see a benefit of that 3 and 6 week application in that double crop or late planting scenario. Similar to what we found last year, there was no significant difference between the 3 and 6 weeks at all of our planting dates. And then for the delayed and the late planting date, we didn't see a significant difference between that 3 week and the no in-season application applied. So once again, it kind of gets a little fuzzy there in between, but if we look at that 3 and 6 weeks application, we are getting a very consistent yield increase, both in a dry year and an overly wet year. And this is kind of highlighted by, once again, this is the yield over here. This is the weather, where the blue bar again is the 2018 precipitation in inches, and the orange is the difference from average. Only September was below average. May was well above average, and we had almost a universal above average year for 2018. So a lot of good benefits and a lot of good value for the soybean there of getting that good natural rainfall. And we saw it from our weed management. It was really important to have the early season management, because good soybean conditions are also good weed conditions. And so we have to make sure to keep those in check. So what are the implications of this? Kind of wrapping this up, I think this highlights the benefit of a good pre-emergence program. Even in late planted soybeans, there's a lot of questions on whether I should put a pre-emergence down on my double crop or really late planted soybeans, and I think that the answer to that is yes. A lot of people get scared off because we often talk about the Cadillac pre-emergence treatment. There are cost-effective options. We have to make sure that we're kind of highlighting and looking at those cost-effective options as well as the Cadillac options, but a good residual pre-emergence program is going to be very important in soybean production. We can't solely rely on NCEIBs and options, especially we can't solely rely on the glyphosate and dicamba or glyphosate and auxin, whether you're dicamba or 2,4-D, to be our only option for weed management. We just won't have the system for long if we do that. We have to rely on our residuals, those good long-term residuals. Early season weed control is critical across all of our planting dates. You had to kind of really had to have it. There is some indication that 3 weeks is all you need, because there really wasn't a consistent benefit to going to that 6-week application from a significant standpoint. However, we did see that most of them did improve yield, just wasn't significant. And there's almost a safety to going out to that 6 weeks application as well. And more often than not, the weed control, the long-term impacts of getting good weed control, and the potential of getting good, strong yield benefits, especially in a good year, I think are going to be worth the cost of most years maintaining that 3 and 6 week weed-free period in all of our planting systems. That's early all the way through our double crop system. But in double crop systems environments going to be critical. We have to make sure that we're planting in good conditions, and if we're putting out a pre, we have to make sure that we have the conditions to make sure that that gets well incorporated. There are other options, and we have to kind of look at those if we aren't going to get that successive rainfall after planting, but we have to make sure that we're starting clean, getting a good residual, and making sure that we stay clean for that 3 and 6 week period. So other questions that kind of come up oftentimes when we talk about this kind of situation is one in our double crop is that I'm worried about high residue situations in the herbicide. And more often than not, a good rain after application can solve this. There's actually a study out of Iowa State that shows that at a 0.6 inch, so just over a ½ inch rain, can wash any herbicide residue off the residue into the soil. If within like 48 hours after application, and with a 1.5 inch rain, it was all herbicide is washed off residue into the soil. So if we get a good rain after application, even in high residue situations, we should be okay. And it's often worth the, I think it's often worth the risk, and we see the value of that pre-emergence program compared to where we don't have it. At 6 weeks after emergence, my soybeans are R2 or later. So this is where we lose glyphosate, and I do believe we start to lose some of the auxins as we go in from a vegetative to a reproductive soybean plant. Is that once you get to either first or full flower, depending on your label and your herbicide you're looking at, we start running into the issue that once you get a pod out, you're pretty much very limited on the herbicides you can use. We still do have herbicides we can use. We have to be a lot more specific on where we're targeting. And so the question we have to ask ourselves is, what are we going after? If we're just going after things like grass, a focused graminicide can often be applied a lot later in the season. If we're going over broadleaf, there are some of our other options that we can use, and so we have to maybe look at those other herbicide options, maybe some of our more traditional herbicides that can be used to very easily control, but maybe just aren't as easy as throwing glyphosate and dicamba in the tank together. So with that, thank you. I hope this system works for everybody. We really want to make sure to highlight some of our work that we have going on here at Oklahoma State University, especially those that are being paid for by our commodities, such as the soybean checkoff and the Oklahoma Soybean Board, which paid for this project. If you have any questions about the project, please feel free to contact me. My contact information is there on the screen. And if you have any information about your Oklahoma Soybean Board, please make sure to reach out and ask some questions about them. And a lot of your commissioners are looking for information on what soybean growers across the state really want to see. So reach out to them if you have any questions about the board or the soybean checkoff. And with that, I really appreciate your time. Look forward to seeing you next time here on Plant Soil Science Spotlight.